Welcome to Belly Dance Alchemy, a captivating blend of the best elements of career and professional development and the magic of belly dance. I'm your host, Kelly Nottingham. Ready to make your day job sparkle and your dance life grow in new and inspiring ways? Well, let's see what we can brew up. So I'm going to start off this episode with some out of the starting gate thoughts to create an understanding right up front on the limits to the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. We're going to be talking about implicit bias, a little bit about how our brains create bias, and how we can potentially overcome biases that we have in our minds, in that deepest part of our minds, that may be affecting the way we interact with other people. My goal with this episode is not to solve all the problems and challenges that we're currently seeing in the world today, particularly with race and gender topics. This is not the solution to larger systemic issues, what we're going to be talking about today. However, it is one small piece to those larger solutions. It's something that we as individuals can take on as a way to learn and improve our own perspectives and how we deal with other people to break down some of the barriers that keep equity from happening. And that can be very powerful. Now, I am not an expert on racism in politics. I am not an expert on gender studies. And to be perfectly transparent, I am a white woman in a heterosexual marriage. I've dealt with gender discrimination in my life, maybe a couple of times dealt with race discrimination. I've been discriminated against because I'm from the U.S. South and all of the ignorant, inbred, uneducated, hillbilly stereotypes that go along with it. But I can in no way speak for people who have dealt with much more severe types of discrimination than I have, and I'm not going to try to. That's not my place. My goal with this podcast is to do what I can with the knowledge and work experience that I have to be the best ally that I can be in ways that I know how. And this is one of the ways I can try to contribute to the conversation in a helpful way. Now, another piece that I wanted to put in place before we start is to understand that we're not, in this episode, particularly just focusing on race and gender. We're talking about a wide variety of biases. I'll be touching on those as we go through this episode. Now, with that being said, I am, during the course of this episode, going to be bringing up some stereotypes that may pop up in modern culture, or that may pop up in some people's minds. They are things that I have heard or seen. I don't hold these stereotypes myself, and I do not endorse them. I wanted to let you all know that some of these may be potentially painful to hear. But it's important to draw attention to these and bring them out into the light, so to speak, so that we can all start to recognize biases that we may have down deep. Lastly, the brain is extremely complex, and researchers are constantly learning more and more about how these squishy pink marvels in our skulls work. So the information shared here may change, and hopefully will change, as more is discovered. So with all of that being said, we're going to jump into this discussion for this episode all about implicit bias, how our brains understand bias, and some techniques that we can use individually to dismantle our biases. So let's start with some larger definitions just to level set on the topics we're going to be discussing today. The first is diversity. Diversity is a recognition that there are differences among people. So the Society for Human Resources Management defines it as the collective mixture of differences and similarities that include, for example, individual and organizational characteristics, values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. That is diversity. Inclusion is including underrepresented people into situations where they may previously not have been included or included only on a superficial or token level. Belonging is a step beyond inclusion and a very important step where each person is allowed to use their full selves in their situation. This may be a new term for a lot of you. And again, language is evolving as we continue to have these discussions. So In a few years, someone listening to this episode may say, wow, she was still using the word inclusion. Yes, because that's the current vernacular that we're using. But this is a constantly evolving topic of conversation as we discuss this more and more. So I wanted to give you a very super simplistic example of the way I like to think about the difference between diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Let's say you have a group of people you're inviting to dinner at your house. Diversity is noticing and maybe pointing out that these people are not all alike. Inclusion is inviting all of them to sit at your table for dinner and serving the same food to everyone, whether or not they eat that kind of food. Belonging is bringing everyone together to create a menu that has something for everyone and that has full contributions from everyone. Now, there are lots of different types of diversity within our art form. There are different races, there are different genders, there are different ages, sexual orientations, skill levels, abilities. Dancers may be differently abled. They may have a diversity of weight or size, language, geographical backgrounds, experience levels, education levels, socioeconomic backgrounds. The list goes on. When we talk about diversity, a lot of times we think about the more obvious sides of diversity, the more visible types of diversity, like race or gender or size. These are topics that have been discussed and continue to be discussed, and that is critically important that they continue to be discussed. And there are also lots of different varieties of diversity that we may not as readily see. So, for example, religious beliefs or socioeconomic background. These are also important types of diversity that may fly under the radar as far as being aware of them because they aren't necessarily in the forefront of our discussions and they're not as easily recognizable. So what is implicit bias? A bias is an opinion toward or away from a particular group, situation, or individual, and it is implicit. Now, you may have heard it be called unconscious bias or subconscious bias. I personally prefer the term implicit. And that means that we don't actually know that the bias exists. So this bias could technically be negative or positive, but because it is implicit and it's happening in the back of our minds, we don't know that it's there. This is very different from an overt or explicit bias. That's where we're making a conscious choice for or against a group, situation, or individual. And that's not going to be addressed in this episode because, frankly, that's one of those things that somebody has to be willing to change for themselves. The discussion we will have about countering implicit bias can have an effect on conscious bias as well, but it's on them to be willing to change an explicit bias. It's on the individual believing those things for an explicit bias to be changed. And unfortunately, if our biases serve us well, we are far less likely to want to acknowledge them or deal with them. Once we become aware of a bias, it moves from being implicit to being explicit. And explicit biases are something that you have decided to accept. So how is implicit bias formed? Now, as I said, there is a ton of research going into this right now, but the way that I like to think about the current science of implicit bias is a very simple formula I've developed: education plus experience plus time. So we're going to talk about each of those three. We're going to start off with education. And education can come in many, many forms. It can include things like conversations that we had when we were young with people who helped to influence our opinions. People like teachers, friends, family, religious leaders, community leaders, and also includes media that we absorbed, especially at younger ages. These ideas and images we shared created a logic in our brains. If A plus B, then C. We're told this repeatedly over the course of our young lives, and that influences the way that we view the world we live in. Biases are also formed by experiences that we may have had that were powerful enough to essentially overwrite other experiences that we may have had. So I'm going to tell a story on my dearly beloved sister. When she was young, she was bitten by a dog, and it was a highly emotionally charged negative experience. And because of that negative emotion that came along with it, it stuck in her head as a major event. She had trusted that this dog was safe to pet, and it ended up not being safe to pet. That negative experience heavily influenced the way that she approached dogs in the future. Now, I was also taught that dogs are safe to pet and didn't have any negative experiences with dogs biting me. In fact, my experiences with dogs have always been very positive throughout my life. Usually, dogs absolutely love me. They actually come running toward me and love to play with me. So my experience has been overall very positive with no major negative events to get in the way over the course of a very long time to reinforce those positive beliefs. In fact, I have a positive bias that animals won't bite me, which has actually resulted in my getting bitten by a bird and a squirrel. But that is a story for another episode. So that's how, we can start to think about education. Now, the human brain is fascinating in many ways. The brain takes in a tremendous amount of information every moment. Britannica says that the human body sends 11 million bits per second to the brain for processing, yet the conscious mind seems to be able to process only 50 bits per second. So it seems that a tremendous amount of compression and filtering is taking place if 11 million bits of information are being reduced to less than 50. What this means is that our brain is constantly looking for ways to process information faster and more efficiently, essentially to create shortcuts, automatic processing, so we don't have to consciously think about everything all the time. Next, the human brain is trying to protect us from bad situations, and in large part, the brain will tell us to focus on negativity and negative experiences because it's trying so hard to keep us safe. I think this is why we will remember one negative comment more clearly and vividly and viscerally than we will remember 100 great compliments. Our brains connect memory to emotions as well. Thus, a stronger emotional response will cause a stronger memory. We tend to have very strong, powerful negative emotions when we feel threatened. Thus, the brain is often wired to a negative bias. We can see something that we've been educated to believe is a threat or that we've experienced as a threat, and so our brains, over time, upon experiencing that stimulus again, will respond with an "I'm being attacked" response. This is a way of our brain making a shortcut, so it doesn't have to consciously think, okay, the last time I saw a dog that looked like that was making that face, I got bit. And therefore, this same dog that is making that same kind of face and looked like that other dog is possibly going to bite me too. Meanwhile, the dog is just staring at you like, what is wrong with this chick? We don't go through that whole process mentally in a conscious way. This is where the implicit bias comes in. Over the course of time, with that thought lingering and being reinforced in our minds of dog making that face will bite me, our brain efficiently develops a shortcut so that we don't have to consciously think about it, and instead we have an immediate gut reaction, an immediate instinctive response without realizing that that thought is even happening. And this is what implicit bias looks like. It's that shortcut in the brain from an experience or education that we have essentially internalized over time to the point where we're no longer consciously thinking about A plus B equals C anymore. Our brains go straight to C. Because of this, we tend to not question it because it's so deeply rooted in our minds that we don't see it anymore. So this is the basic equation for how unconscious bias works. It is education plus experience plus time to create a thought pattern that sinks into the subconscious pathways of our brain. So now what I would like to do is a little self-exploration quiz. Because these biases are so deeply rooted, we don't see that they exist. And because we don't see that they exist, we can't address them. We have to recognize that they exist in our individual minds before we're able to address whether there's something we want to continue to hold on to consciously or something that we want to change and give up. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to list out some situations and group and individual stereotypes. I would like for you to capture your first gut reaction and your first thoughts about these groups of people so that you can begin to address and recognize whether or not you may have a bias in this way. So what is the first reaction that pops up for you when I mention a male belly dancer, a transgender belly dancer, a 70-year-old belly dancer, a stripper who wants to learn to belly dance, a dancer from the Middle East, a blonde belly dancer, a black belly dancer, a very thin belly dancer, a plus-sized belly dancer, a Russian belly dancer, an American belly dancer, a dancer who uses the term belly dancer, a dancer who only learns via DVD or YouTube, a Rocks Sharky style dancer, a tribal fusion dancer. Now, here are some questions to probe a little bit further into some of these possible biases. Do you believe that male belly dancers are somehow more effective as teachers and performers? Or do you feel that male dancers are put on a pedestal because they are more rare and we culturally have a bias toward males in authority? Do you believe that being a white dancer automatically makes a dancer more likely to be racist? Do you believe that plus-size dancers are less interesting or appealing to watch? Do you assume that they did not have either the drive or the willpower to lose weight? Do you believe that folkloric-style dancers just don't have the skill to do tribal fusion? Do you think that tribal fusion dancers don't have the skill or the education to do traditional folkloric dances? Do you assume that all belly dancers think kindly about Middle Eastern cultures? Do you assume that because a person comes from the Middle East or has Middle Eastern ethnic roots, that they naturally know more about the dance, whether or not they actually were exposed to it growing up? Are dancers of color automatically exempted from questions of cultural appropriation by virtue of skin color or quote-unquote ethnic roots? Does having dancers of different ages, races, and size affect the cohesion of a troupe performing on stage? Are dancers who do more modern styles of dance more woke to social issues than dancers who perform more traditional styles of dance? Now, hopefully these statements did not upset any of you. That was not my intention. Again, I wanted to just be aware of biases that I have seen and heard and witnessed so that we can start to really dissect them, pull them apart so that we can begin to solve for them. Now, one interesting thought about biases is that positive biases we tend to think of as being positive. However, positive biases that are taken too far can actually result in the opposite bias also becoming true, and you develop a negative bias out of a strong positive bias. So here's an example. Women are great. Women are the best. Therefore, men are the worst. The goal here is to get you thinking about what's going on in the back of that automatic processing in your brain. Having biases in itself does not make you a bad person. We all have them. We all have them. Our brains all work this way. But biases can cause us to behave in ways that are divisive, exclusionary, and hurtful. Now, this brings up an interesting point that I wanted to bring out as well, because this is one that I actually myself have struggled with, especially in relation to myself. Our biases can affect and do strongly affect our self-talk, our self-image, and our senses of esteem. I was raised in ballet from a very young age and was given a lot of life lessons from, I think, well-meaning family and friends that in order to be successful and look put together and be successful not only as a dancer, but also just in life, that you needed to be thin. I was told that fat was a sign of being lazy and of not having any sense of self-worth. I internalized these messages from a very young age. Thankfully, and this is one of the reasons why I am so grateful to belly dance, is because it has really forced me both literally and figuratively to look in a mirror and question what my whole life I was taught about what healthy looks like, what beautiful looks like, what strong looks like, and what talented looks like. I am extremely self-critical of my own body, much more so than I'm critical of anybody else's body, because of the bias that still exists in my brain and that messaging that I got at a young age. If I were fit enough or if I were thin enough, I would be more successful as a dancer. People would want to watch me perform more. I feel shame about my body sometimes. And so this is a constant vigilance about this dismantling of bias for me, because it is so deeply rooted and it has been so heavily reinforced throughout my life that self-acceptance becomes difficult. Now, I'm sure many of you are probably listening to this and saying, yes, I know exactly what you mean. And I've been, working through this as well. I think this is another really important aspect of implicit bias, that biases can actually be against ourselves as well. So now that we've gone through those challenging statements and hopefully caused you to think about some biases that you may be holding, what can be done once we recognize the biases that we have? Because we all have them, we have to make a conscious effort to push back on these biases. And it requires essentially rewiring our brains so that the biases are eventually replaced with a more productive, instinctual thought pattern. Now, there are several key ways that we can start to dismantle our own biases, and some of these, as you listen, may not seem like rocket science, but that's because they aren't rocket science. They take commitment and diligence, but they don't necessarily require years and years of expensive psychotherapy. Now, that being said, if you find that you're having a big challenge with bias, it may be impacting your professional life or your personal life, it never hurts to talk to a therapist who can help you to work through that. So if implicit biases are comprised of education plus experience plus time, guess what it takes to dismantle and replace them with something better? You guessed it. Education plus experience plus time. So let's start with changing your education. Education comes in many forms, including awareness of the messaging that we've been told and the inputs that we are constantly cramming into our brains by way of the people we surround ourselves with and all of the media that we take in. So step one is realizing, first of all, that you have the biased thoughts. This takes practice and time to start catching these fleeting first thoughts, but it can be done. Step two, when you catch a biased thought, ask yourself, where did that thought come from? What is your earliest memory of that particular group that's the subject of the bias? Sometimes when you sit with these thoughts for a minute, you'll hear the voice of the person who told you these things, or you'll see images in your mind of where you were first exposed to that group as being other. Once you see those, you can start to address them. Are they actually true? What was the person's intention in saying that to us? What bias may have led them to say those things on their behalf? Step three, what is a truer thought? What is the desired thought you want to replace your bias with? If you don't know much about a group, which is very common when we have a bias, consciously educate yourself. Learn as much as possible about their perspectives, their history, and their culture. Now, one huge caveat to this. Please don't expect them to want to educate you on their perspectives and issues. From talking to colleagues and friends of mine who are underrepresented in the workplaces that I've been in the dance communities that I've been in, many of them have said, frankly, they're tired of being the ones trying to educate. We have the internet. We can learn a lot on our own. Look at what they say about themselves, not what other people say about them. Now, speaking of the internet, it can do a number on our education piece. Algorithms will feed you similar content on most news and social media sites, meaning that you're going to fall head first into a cultural echo chamber. We isolate our brains into only seeing small groups of people depending on what we curate for ourselves. In the perfectionism episode, I talked about consciously curating your context, and this is absolutely relevant here. When we have a non-diverse context, it leads us to think that the virtual version of our world is reality when it's not. We go into these bubbles where we assume that because we don't see it, it doesn't exist. Now, if you find that you're only seeing people like you on your social media, it might be time to do a little exploring. Fall down the rabbit hole of the internet to find people who aren't like you. This can help to reset what your brain understands as normal. Next up, broadening our experiences. Another way to really start catching those thoughts, because they're super quick, is to look at the group of people with whom we normally associate or who are normally in your environment. If you're surrounded by people who have similarities to you, it may just be a happenstance of geography, but it can also point out biases that we may have, and it can help us to put a magnifying glass on those biases. Now, this is not to say that you have a bias against Buddhists because you don't have any Buddhists in your social circle, but it is far more common to have some type of bias about a group to which we do not belong. This is particularly true if you've never had contact with somebody from a particular group, or you've never had good in-depth conversations with an individual from a particular group. Once you recognize who you may be excluding from your social circle, or who you would like to know more about, you can take steps to determine why and consciously broaden your circle of experience. Recognize that a negative experience with one person from a group is not representative of the entire group. One key way to break down our implicit biases is focusing on recognizing people as individuals. Yes, they may be part of a specific group, but that group doesn't determine everything about that person. Generalizations are the foundation of implicit bias. Making assumptions about a group and transferring that assumption to an individual is what implicit bias is all about. All right, so now, time. These ideas, recognizing biased thoughts and looking at where they came from, consciously replacing them, broadening our experiences, these all take time to settle in. Well-developed neural pathways are like highways in our brains. Our thoughts zoom down them easily, effortlessly, and really fast. It takes time to start a new pathway. First, it's like a little dirt road, and then it gets a bit bigger. Over time, it maybe gets paved, and then eventually that new thought will become the new neural pathway, your new highway. But we have to give it time and repetition to really sink in. Okay, so I'm going to share an example here, a personal example, to show you how this education plus experience plus time thing works. So I'm a child of the 80s, and I really, truly hope that I don't offend any of my listeners here when I talk about this mode of growing up in the 80s in the US that I experienced. This was during the Cold War, and for those of you who did not grow up in the 80s in the US, it was a time where we practiced drills in elementary school against nuclear attacks, because there was always a fear culturally that the Soviet Union, the USSR, hated us and were trying to destroy us. Growing up, I was a ballet dancer and had tremendous admiration for Russian and Ukrainian ballet dancers like Mikhail Baryshnikov, who defected from the Soviet Union. And that was a story that was played out multiple times in the media when I was a kid growing up. We would watch the Olympics and see these amazing Soviet ice skaters or Soviet gymnasts, and then find out that they had defected. And it was lauded in our media here in the US as being a victory against an evil, oppressive regime. This was drilled into our heads as kids. Our education, both in school, with sports coverage, and literally every single movie in the 80s that had a bad guy was all about scary, dangerous Soviet people. And then we had the addition of repeated experiences like these school drills to make sure we knew what to do when attacked over long periods of time. This kind of stuff goes deep into the little kid's brain, you know what I mean? So it's interesting how after the Berlin Wall fell and after the Soviet Union broke up, movies began to focus on different groups to be the bad guys. I just find this fascinating. Now, growing up, I did not know any people from the former Soviet Union until I got much older and was in college and was able to meet people and talk to them. And of course, the propaganda that they dealt with in their childhood went the exact reverse of the propaganda that we dealt with. We were the bad guys in their propaganda. But meeting people, talking to them, realizing that we were all products of the education plus experience plus time that we had dealt with growing up, and seeing these people, meeting them as individuals and getting to talk to them and finding common ground with them helped break down those biases for me. I even studied Russian in graduate school, and I would love to visit Russia someday. It's on my bucket list to visit Russia. So let's take this episode for our final spin. Some things I would like to encourage you to think about over the next few weeks. I know I will be doing the same. Look at your education, both formal and informal, growing up. What group or groups were considered other from your own in-group? And what was given as reasons for that? What groups might be unintentionally excluded from your social circle? What are you curious about regarding that group? And where can you learn more about that? Is your context very homogeneous? How can you widen your context today? So that's a very short introduction to implicit bias and some things we can do to dismantle it for ourselves. This is just scratching the surface. So I encourage you to learn more about this, dig into this, and let's create some new neural pathways for ourselves. Bye, everybody.
Well, thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to this podcast and share the magic with your dance friends. If you want more, you can sign up for our mailing list at bellydancealchemy.org, or you can email me your suggestions and feedback. I would love to hear from you at bellydancealchemypodcast@gmail.com. Bye.